Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. My name is Rebecca Duclos, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts here at Concordia University. It's a particular pleasure and honor for me to welcome our second speaker and wonderful guest, Michael Rakowitz, within the newly inaugurated Wild Talks series. Before we get going, though, I'd like to first acknowledge Catherine Wild, the former Dean of Fine Arts, after whom this series is named. In 2015, after 10 years of dedicated service, Catherine's guidance of the faculty and her commitment to this university was recognized by many admiring colleagues and friends, but it was one of them in particular, Erin Hogg, who honored Catherine through a gift that will support the Wild Talks for some years to come. Erin's generosity to Concordia goes back many years, but her special support of the Wild Talks in this faculty specifically goes hand in hand with Catherine's own doubled interests in creating conditions for sustained stewardship and creating platforms for shared experience. The talks give the faculty the unprecedented opportunity to invite someone such as Michael to spend some time with us, to speak to all of you, and to be in the studios with the students tomorrow. Michael will also be in the booth with Sanaz Sarabi, a Concordia graduate student who knows Michael from previous years, as well as two faculty members, Tamarel Sheikh and David Howes. They'll all be in the recording studio tomorrow for one of our Thinking Out Loud podcasts that the university has been producing for distribution to a larger public. So you can keep your ears open for that. And speaking of the public, in bringing this talk to life, it's been our great privilege to work once again with the Musée d'Art Contemporain, our sister institution who, like this faculty, endeavors to infuse the city with vibrant programming, extraordinary artists, and significant exhibitions. In conjunction with the MAC's current show, Leonard Cohen, A Crack in Everything, in which Michael's work appears, I want to thank Francois Letourneau for sustaining this invaluable partnership. And I would like to give a huge shout out to Julie Johnston, Mark Sussman, and Peggy Killeen here in the faculty for making this visit happen. It couldn't have happened without any of them. And finally, let's extend a very warm welcome to our dear guest, Michael Rakowitz, who in many ways is no stranger to Montreal in terms of his personal connections to this city through his wife's family. But this will be the first time that Michael has exhibited at the MAC, and the first time he's been to Concordia. So we're thrilled that he eagerly accepted our invitation, which involved him flying for a second time up to Montreal from Chicago after attending the Cohen Vernissage a couple weeks ago. Maybe it was only last week. It seems like a couple weeks ago. And it hardly seems fair to celebrate Michael's presence here with us by talking first about absence or loss. But as you'll soon find out, this is one of the stronger themes in his work, so I hope you won't mind. I first met Michael, or rather, I was first introduced to Michael's work in 2015 through a fish, or to put a finer point on it, a dead fish. By the time I showed up to the Salvin Galleries at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I was working, the body in question was floating in the slightly murky waters of a circular upright wading pool that had been installed in the last room of a massive open gallery space. Following much wrangling with wildlife permits, structural analyses of the weight-bearing load of the gallery floor, and some pretty lively cargo being brought up the school's elevators into the space, the high-sided pool had been filled a few days earlier with live carp, a certain powerful bony fish that many of you will know. These critters were part of Michael's piece within a series of exhibitions, an extraordinary book series, and a suite of ambitious programs that came under the banner A Lived Practice. The show that Michael and his carp were part of was entitled A Proximity of Consciousness, Art and Social Action. There's a lot that I could say, but I won't, about that exhibition, which included a number of artists in addition to Michael. Rather, the reason I bring it up now is that for me, the best part of that whole show was the dead carp, that only later became an inadvertent highlight of Michael's work in my mind. Somehow, that limp fish that was so vigorously moving just moments before, and that was then suddenly lost to the world, became a symbol for what characterizes certain aspects of Michael's practice, namely two aspects: the loss of life, of memory, of time, of objects, and the indexical role that gallery artifacts, both living and dead, play in his practice, that, to be honest, mostly happens outside the cultural construct of the exhibition space anyway. So in this case, the tiny school of carp, which I should add were mostly alive during the run of the exhibition, gestured to a couple of Michael's longer-lived social practice projects. Every weapon is a tool if you hold it right, and Enemy Kitchen, both of which exemplify his self-described interest in using simple provocations to reveal the complexities of human relationships. His projects are too thick to unpack here, and that's Michael's job anyway in a few seconds. So I simply want to say how much, from that moment on, I have admired his subtlety and his humility. That by focusing our minds on what is not there, or in some cases the opposite, by making spaces in which new things can quietly appear, Michael is able to bring us into relationships with the world that are wholly unexpected and are always awakening. As we stare into the murky pool teeming with life, it's the dead carp that for that instant is actually the most beautiful fish in the school. It's the one that reminds us most of where we actually reside, always on the cusp of the living and the dead. So thank you, Michael, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Rebecca. Are there any questions? I don't know that I really want to follow that. That was really lovely and meaningful, and I really appreciate that. Most of those fish did survive, and they actually went to the Shed Aquarium afterwards in Chicago. So actually, when I do my resume and I list public collections, the Shed Aquarium is on top. That's the one I'm the most proud of somehow. But I want to thank Concordia University. I want to thank Rebecca Duclos, Mark Sussman, Julie Johnston, and everybody who's involved for hosting me here. Ted, who heroically set up the technology with very little time before. And I want to thank François Le Tourneau at the MAC, and John Zappatelli and Victor Schiffman for this wild ride that we've had for the past 2 years that still seems like it's not going to end anytime soon. And everybody at the MAC who's here, Sophie, Marie-Chantal, Geneviève, everyone, thank you so much for your hospitality and your belief in my work, and for including me in an exhibition about a poet who gives me a lot, and a city that's given me quite a lot in terms of the ultimate thing that one can be given, which is family. So it really is an honor to be here. Okay, so just a little bit of introduction in terms of bio. I'm from Great Neck, New York, the infamous Great Neck, New York. Why Great Neck? Well, it's an interesting story. My grandfather is from Baghdad, and he arrived with his family in New York in 1946 after they fled for political reasons. And he ended up in New York City after coming in through San Francisco to the United States. And he was told by a man from Damascus in Manhattan that a really good place to live was in Port Washington. And on Long Island, that's on this Port Washington line. It's the end of the line. It's the red line. They're all color-coded like they are everywhere else in the world. And he fell asleep on the train. He woke up completely scared that he missed his stop, not realizing that it was the last stop. And he got out, and it happened to be at Great Neck. He bought a house, and that's how all the Iraqi Jews ended up in Great Neck. So sometimes mistakes become cultures. These are the houses that I grew up looking at in Great Neck, these nice Victorian homes that dotted every street, lots of green, good schools. And this is 6 Gateway Drive, which for 2 years was the residence of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it was the very house where he began writing The Great Gatsby. And Great Neck was West Egg, whereas Port Washington and Roslyn were what inspired East Egg. I used to go to synagogue, and my mother would point out during Rosh Hashanah services, as I started to get very bored, to focus on the man who was in the front row, who happened to be Andy Kaufman, who was my favorite cast member of Saturday Night Live. And she said, "That's the man who sings Mighty Mouse. That's the man who makes you laugh so much." And this is a photograph of Andy Kaufman reading The Great Gatsby from cover to cover as one of his performance art endurance comedic performances. This is a house that you can actually buy in Kings Point right now. It's on the market. Kings Point is the most expensive area of Great Neck. We couldn't live there, but my aunt did. We didn't get along. This is that very same house juxtaposed with one of Saddam Hussein's palaces in Baghdad. So that's about all you need to know about me. In terms of what we're going to do tonight, I was asked to pick a theme, and it's one of the things I'm loath to do because I don't like academic talks, but I chose the theme of ghosting with a G in apostrophes, not in apostrophes, in parentheses before hosting. And I'm very interested in hosting and the notion of hospitality and hostility, which both come from the same Latin root words of hostis and hospice. And that kind of intersection is also a place where I find the ability to intersect problem solving and trouble making. And so what you'll find is that the works that I'm going to show tonight are mostly ongoing. They started at some point, but they've never truly finished. And every good ghost that I know shows up and leaves, but then comes again. You know, otherwise you can't really call it a haunting. So, a guest plus a host equals a ghost is a piece by Marcel Duchamp that's been very, very important to me. Most of you will probably know this history. It was a piece of candy that was distributed at the opening of Bill Copley's exhibition in 1953 in Paris. And aside from it being this incredibly smart wordplay, it's also implicating the actual object, the candy wrapper, in which these candies were once housed, becomes like this shroud, a remnant, or a ghost. And this material urgency is something that's been a part of my work since the very beginning. The oldest work that I'm going to show tonight is a piece called Parasite, which was a work that I began in graduate school. And it came in the aftermath of research that I was doing in Jordan on the tents and the equipment of the Bedouin during an architecture residency there. And I learned there that the tents were set up differently each night to take into account the wind patterns that were moving through the desert. So it was almost like the aerodynamics of sailing, but it was also incredibly magical because these nomadic desert dwellers had figured out the way that the wind could be predicted or projected to be moving throughout the desert. And so I came away with this data, not knowing what I was going to do with it until I came across an event in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the winter of 1997, 1997, and the warm air that was coming from the vent of the building was the wind that was the byproduct of a building's comfort system, a service system, keeping the people inside at a regulated temperature and then being recycled by the person outside to survive the night. So in my mind, the cosmology for this project began almost immediately about harnessing that invisible material that was allowing for a certain kind of resistance to disappear, a certain kind of ability for the homeless person to haunt and to make clear that they were not nomadic by tradition, like the nomads of the desert, like the Bedouin, but they were nomadic because of the social conditions created by hypercapitalism and by North American sort of urbanist ideologies that have failed. And so each shelter is built on a $0 budget in terms of materials. They're custom built. I've been doing this for over 20 years now, and I've made them for about 80 different homeless people in different cities. And they use rubbish bags, plastic tape, and pretty much any kind of material that will inflate that one can find on the streets. So it speaks that same material urgency where it uses these shrouds that are the byproducts of other goods and other consumables to make something that can enable something to survive. This was a shelter that I built for Bill Stone, and Bill asked me to actually make him a shelter that allowed him to see out into the world at the position if he was sitting up and if he was lying down. So it's like a panoptic view where there's a series of windows, 6 that run the circumference if he's sitting up, and then another at the very bottom so he can see out. And for him, he said that the most important thing was visibility, because visibility allowed for the homeless people to see potential attackers, and it also allowed them to be seen. And for him, it was a little bit the way that Hannah Arendt talks about visibility being somewhere on the road to equality, that they were already invisible. And this was something that enabled them to redefine or reinscribe their experience materially into the world and to appear as these uncomfortable ghosts. And this is a shelter that I built for George Livingston, a friend of Bill Stone's, and he came into my studio and saw that I was working with a kind of A-frame technology, and I kept referring to it as air ribs. And George made the kind of gastronomic connection to eating ribs. And he said, well, the bones are what you throw away. It's the meat that's important, and he wanted to be the meat. And so in between these semi-translucent bones that give the shelter its structure, he requested a series of Ziploc bags that enable him to regulate the levels of publicity and privacy by putting his belongings in them. And they also ended up, as a kind of byproduct, producing a kind of reliquary that shows the different objects that are involved in a homeless person's everyday life. And this was a pretty special night in 1998 in the winter. George and Bill and their entire crew came to my studio door, and they told me that they found the vent that blew the hottest and the hardest in all of Boston and Cambridge. They actually started to map the city based on the warm air that was leaving buildings. And this one happened to be the MIT Plasma Transfusion Laboratories. And they were able to get 2 shelters off the same vent. And this is Bill and George in front of Bill's white shelter. And Bill on the left, George on the right, and in the middle is Freddie Flynn. And in the 20 years I've been doing this project, Freddie's shelter is the one that took me the longest to do. It was the most complicated. And he came to me and said, Bill and George told me you'll make anything I want. And I told him that was right. And he said, anything? And he produced a picture from a magazine that he tore this picture out of this magazine. And he was a big science fiction fan, and it was a picture of Jabba the Hutt. So I got to live out this fantasy from when I was 10 years old of finding some excuse to make a life-size Star Wars character out of plastic bags and air. He said I did an okay job. And then the project moved to New York, and the reason I'm showing these last 2 slides is because in a way the project began as something about architecture and suddenly became portraiture. So that each person who I was building for were addressing their needs, but also their desires. That even in this space of urgency, there was a desire to recoup some joy and some love from these margins that they were living within. And so this was for a man named Artie and his girlfriend Myra. They were the first couple I built for. And he told me that he wanted a shelter that had a bubble that allowed for the 2 of them to sit in there and to read to each other. And then a low-lying area that he called the loving room, which was the loving room. And about 10 days into making the shelter, he told me that I had to stop, that the design was all wrong. And I asked him what was the problem. And he said, Myra talks too much. So we need 2 sitting areas, and the loving room in between, it should look like a dog bone or a bra. And so again, like these humors that rise to the surface end up becoming these stories of these other citizens whose lives end up disappearing. And a word about the title is that I was thinking even as far back about this idea of hospitality and of hosting, and of the building being a host. The building also being like the air leaving the building being a form of architectural CPR, breathing life into lungs and keeping another edifice alive. But also the visible kind of appearance is one of the host and its parasite. And the notion of the parasite being this obnoxious term that's given by city infrastructure to describe its homeless inhabitants, but also to kind of keep this from becoming a permanent solution. So para became a really important prefix for me in French because it means to guard against. Parapluie, parasol, parachute, to guard against falling. And parasite, to guard against it becoming a permanent situation as well, and guarding against this notion of permanence. And so it became a project that for me started to wrap up so many of my interests about the commodification of urban space, but also looking back to a sort of nomadism that my own family came out of, which I'll be discussing in some of these later projects. And this is the first time that I actually published the step-by-step instructions, and it was here in Montreal, when the piece was shown at the CCA. And L'Itinéraire, which I believe still exists, is a magazine that's distributed by homeless people and also enlists homeless people to write editorials. So the step-by-step instructions get printed every winter in a different city in one of these street newspapers, so that it also disseminates and disperses these skill sets into the actual population for which it's made, but it's also accompanied by an editorial or a critique from a homeless person who's using the shelter. So this is my grandfather's family in Iraq. This is a photo from around the 1930s and the 1920s. And my grandfather's name is Nisim Isaac Daoud bin Aziz. He's the one who's the second in from the left in the three-piece suit. And here he is with his family, so large that they extend beyond the desert oasis backdrop. And the stories that my grandparents told me were the ones that I felt were starting to disappear or risk disappearance in the aftermath of the Gulf Wars that happened, the Gulf War in 1991 and then the Iraq War in 2003. The first images I'm going to show you here are of an emptied out museum. And this is the National Museum of Iraq after it was looted in April of 2003. In 2006, I traveled to Berlin, and for the first time I went to the Pergamon Museum. And the Pergamon Museum was a place that I had known about for quite some time. It was a contested space for many people. It continues to be because it houses the Pergamon altar, which was taken by the Germans from what is now modern-day Turkey, and it resides in Berlin. What I didn't know was that it was also the place where the Ishtar Gate was housed. The Ishtar Gate was built in 575 BC under Nebuchadnezzar. It was one of the main entrances to Babylon, and it was through the Ishtar Gate that the processional way passed. The name for this processional way in Babylonian was Ajibor Shapu, which translates to "the invisible enemy should not exist." It's the coolest name of a street I've ever heard, kind of like a Jenny Holzer truism, but it's also the name of this project. Here's the Ishtar Gate in its full grandeur. It was excavated in the early 1900s by Robert Koldewey, a German archaeologist, who brought the gate back to Germany brick by brick and installed it in the Pergamon. Any missing bricks were actually reconstructed by the museum team and restorers to give the gate its full sort of physical presence as it would have been in Babylon. In 2007, if you looked up Ishtar Gate on Google Images, this was the first image that came up. This is a plaster, plywood, and 2x4 reconstruction that was commissioned by the Iraqi government in the 1950s to replace what the Germans had stolen. And so this is a kind of a ghost, but it was also supposed to stand as the entrance to a museum which was never completed. So for this project, and it's one of the favorite Look Mom, I'm in Iraq photos that American soldiers took when they were stationed there. And they would photograph themselves there, and then another group of soldiers would move in. So the story is replicated in drawings that end up forming the kind of narrative perimeter of the installation. And then it goes on to describe the connections between something like the excavation of the Ishtar Gate and then the installation in Germany to the looting of the Iraq Museum. The Iraq Museum was pillaged from the 10th until the 12th of April 2003, shortly after the fall of Baghdad. Display cases were emptied, dropped artifacts damaged, and storage vaults robbed. Many missing items have since been recovered through international policing and amnesty for looters. Each returned object is photographed on a long wooden table among all other recuperated goods, the resulting photos serving as a visual archive. Fakes, as well as reproductions that are sold in the museum's gift shop, have also been brought back. Dr. Donny George served as president of the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage and director general of the National Museum in Baghdad. In the aftermath of the looting, he worked tirelessly to help recover some 50% of missing items. However, because the museum continues to be a soft target for insurgents, international policing agencies from Kuwait and Iran to Japan, Italy, and the US are for now retaining any confiscated museum objects. Under Saddam Hussein, Dr. George took part directly in archaeological excavations in order to avoid Ba'ath Party meetings. Now, this was a really important detail. He was an Assyrian Christian, and in order for him to hold the position that he had at the Iraq Museum, he had to be a member of the party, whose ideals were completely disparate from his own. And so in order to hold power and be able to safeguard Iraq's cultural heritage, he had to unwillingly become part of the party. But he started to do what no director of museum does, which is to participate directly in the excavations. And so he'd be up at Tel Harmal, and he would say, I'm sorry, we found something amazing. I can't be at the meeting in Baghdad. And I loved this circumvention that was happening through his position at the museum. Dr. George also sidelined as a drummer in a band called 99%, short for 99% of Excellence, that specialized in covers of Deep Purple and Pink Floyd songs. And this is where I fell in love with him. He was an artist. Deep Purple, Smoke on the Water, recalls a disastrous fire during a 1971 Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention concert at a casino in Montreux, Switzerland. A fan shot a flare gun inside the venue, a fire ensued, and the entire building was destroyed. Members of Deep Purple watched the events unfold across Lake Geneva in a mobile studio on loan from the Rolling Stones. Oh, okay, sorry. After receiving a letter with a bullet enclosed from extremists who threatened to harm his family if a ransom was not paid, Dr. George resigned his post, fleeing to Syria in August of 2006. In December 2006, Dr. George arrived with his family in the United States, having accepted a position as a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. Ahlan wa sahlan, Dr. George. So, like I said, these drawings create the kind of narrative perimeter of the installation, the main part of which is an ongoing work that I began in 2007 with a team of assistants in Chicago that's grown to number 28 different pairs of hands that have engaged with the Iraq Museum's database in order to reconstruct any of the artifacts, or making the 7,000 artifacts that are still listed as missing, stolen, destroyed, or status unknown. One of them is in the audience, Sanaz Sarabi, who was part of the studio up until she was decided to pursue her PhD here at Concordia. We miss you. And so each artifact is made out of the detritus of Middle Eastern food packages and the Arabic English newspapers that one finds throughout the United States where there is an Arab presence. So it's about these fragments of cultural visibility being enlisted to make these things that are now, for all intents and purposes, invisible. And so here's the wooden table that these artifacts then get placed on when they are brought back to the museum, so that a visual archive is created of anything that they've recuperated. And then the centerpiece of the exhibition mimics that same kind of a table. And so the database that we work with is at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which is an American encyclopedic museum down on the south side of Chicago that actually has had the longest relationship with the Iraq Museum since it was founded by Gertrude Bell. And they went live with a database right after the looting for two reasons. One was to deter any collectors that were maybe buying on the gray or the black market to do a side-by-side comparison with the Mesopotamian artifact that they were being offered and the photograph of the artifact that you can find when you click on any of these numbers. The other was to educate the world on just how much human cultural patrimony had just been wiped off the face of the earth, including the first examples of writing, of urban laws, of urban planning. And so it was a little bit like those black and white photographs of missing children that you would find on the backs of milk cartons in the 1980s. So you click on the number, and the museum number, the excavation number, the dimensions come up, and then oftentimes there's pictures of the artifact from all different sides, so it makes a sculptor's job relatively easy. So again, it's using these materials of urgency, because there's also this desire to create a surrogate, not a replacement, an effigy or an aura or a spirit of what's been lost, a kind of ghost, and to not be foolish to think that we can just completely reconstruct history through 3D printing or the like. And so this last piece of the project that I'm going to show is another form of covering, another form of reconstruction. And the soundtrack for the exhibition, when you look at the work in a museum space, you hear an Arabic cover version of Smoke on the Water that I commissioned from a band in New York called Ayub. So we'll play a little bit of that for you. So instead of the guitar solo by Blackmore, you have this amazing bouzouki solo by Tarek Abushi, and the whole thing sort of collapses into the craziness of this cover. The pieces are also shown with accession cards, very similar to the way that they'd be shown in any museum context, any archaeological institutional context, where it reproduces the information that one finds at a place like the Oriental Institute or in the Iraq Museum, but instead of there being a paragraph about what the object is, what it might have been used for, there are these fragments of different quotes from people reacting to the looting around the world. So you end up on the table with this kind of fragmented, unlikely conversation between the different antagonists and protagonists. So in this case, this crazy statement by Fiorella Strica, the Gulf Wars had the single positive result of awakening international interest for the culture of Mesopotamia. To Satan's favorite poet, Donald Rumsfeld, let me say one other thing. The images you are seeing on television, you are seeing over and over and over, and it's the same picture of some person walking out of some building with a vase. And you see it 20 times and you think, my goodness, were there that many vases? Is it possible that there were that many vases in the whole country? You know, but let's all admire Bush's paintings, right? And then people like Donny George, who would tell stories about why certain things were looted. This piece has a very nice story. It was taken by two young men during the looting. They took 9 very nice pieces to their houses. They came to us after the looting and they said, don't ask for our names or addresses. We were in the museum at the time of the looting. We felt very sorry because we could not stop anything. Then they decided they would take things and bring them back when it was safe, and they did it. As soon as we had the American soldiers protecting the museum, they brought back the 9 pieces. And so in February of 2007, I was introduced to Donny George. He had actually, as the drawing said, was on his way to the United States via Syria to take a post at SUNY Stony Brook as a visiting professor. And I was quite nervous. You know, I had already started this project. So much of it was about him. And I wanted to be careful about him getting the wrong message, arriving in New York after fleeing for his life, and this weird artist is doing a project about him. But we had mutual friends who invited me to a brunch for Donny George. And it wasn't just a brunch. It was actually a very beautiful and moving experience. I was in an apartment in Manhattan in Sutton Place where the entire archaeological community of New York had descended on Donny to welcome him. But they also bought copies of all the books that he had to leave behind in Iraq. So they had replaced and gifted him a copy of every single book. So there was a total reconstruction of his institutional knowledge replicated in the United States. And Donny came up to me, and he had already read the art newspaper, which had reproduced a photo of him and had followed his story since he led the recuperation efforts at the museum. And he wanted to know, how the hell did I get a picture of him playing the drums? So they had actually run with this headline, revealed Donny George rock star. And this was the thing that he was happiest about in the entire project. And there's no YouTube videos of 99%. There's no MP3s. There's no images in Google Images. And so I told him, I went online and I found a picture of him looking kind of bored at a meeting, and then a picture of this guy, and then through the magic of Photoshop, you get this. And he said to me, that's archaeology too. So the entire practice for me is not to be trusted. And when I was back in Chicago, my gallery in New York sent me pictures of Donny. He started to visit the gallery with the reconstructed artifacts quite often, and he would stay there for hours, and he would give tours to gallery goers of the artifacts the same way as he would have given tours at the museum in Baghdad. And when I spoke to him afterwards about this, he told me that he became very emotional. And the reason was that he realized that this was as close as he was ever going to get to the actual artifacts again. and that they had all been made at the right size. And even though they were made out of different materials, they appeared to him like ghosts. And it ends up being doubly sad to look at these images because Donny himself passed away in 2011. He died in between two countries when he was on the way to give a lecture in Toronto before he actually made it to immigration. He died of a heart attack. And so when he died, it was like losing the rain. And so this is the newest iteration of the project that's going to appear this year in Trafalgar Square on the Fourth Plinth. And Sanaz is responsible for the construction of this maquette. So if I get anything wrong, let me know. But I started to research, once I was nominated for the plinth, the actual measurements and the time in which it was built. And for those of you who don't know, the plinth itself was supposed to have a statue of a king on it when it was made in 1841, but the city of London ran out of money. And so it's stayed emptied since then, and the most recent artist on the plinth was David Shrigley, and before that was Hans Hake. And so I had done a kind of research into just the actual physical measurements of the plinth to figure out what to propose and what scale to make it, and it ended up being 14 feet. And 14 feet was actually the exact measurement of the Lamassu that stood at the Nergal Gate in Nineveh and had been destroyed by ISIS in 2015. So it was the first iteration of this project that started to pick up not just on the looting of the Iraq Museum, but to acknowledge that the war for the Iraqis hasn't ended, and that this continuation of the destruction not only of their cultural history, but of their memory of their contemporary life, and also the ecology, was something that I wanted to continue to speak about. And so I proposed reconstructing the Lamassu atop the Ishtar Gate, and it turned out that it had actually been excavated by a Brit, by Austin Henry Layard, an archaeologist from the UK, in 1849. So there's that 8-year window in which that Lamassu was waiting to reveal itself. And so it will reveal itself once again in London on Trafalgar Square. And the materials that I'm using to make it are Iraqi date syrup cans, which I'll talk about in a little bit. They'll hold up to the weather. But the idea is that this reconstruction set on the Fourth Plinth will allow an apparition to haunt Trafalgar Square. Unlike the pair of Lamassu housed inside the British Museum, the recreation will stand outside with wings raised, still performing his duty as guardian of Iraq's past and present, hoping to return in the future. And Ella Shohat, when she was writing about this, wrote that the reincarnated Lamassu cries out against the multiple contemporary forces that enact the catastrophic liquidation of human lives, of ecological equilibrium, and of cultural inheritance. So that what I'm pointing to with the date syrup cans is the fact that the date syrup itself is coming from a tree, the date palm, which numbered 30 million in Iraq at the height of the 70s. And then at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, that number had been halved, and by the end of the Gulf War, only 3 million remained. So it takes this kind of view where it steps away from the anthropocentric and starts to look at the landscape and the ecology of Iraq as being something that's also been completely lost, which is something that the non-human actors are never really spoken about in the aftermath of war. And so this is just a Photoshop of what it might look like. So back to this picture, and so that's my grandfather. And in terms of illustrating the existence of what I call Arab Jews, this is my grandfather on the right-hand side and his brother Salim on the left. This is the family on their way to the United States. And that's my mother in my Uncle David's arms. And this is perhaps the biggest influence on my practice to date. That's my grandmother, Renee Shamoun. She's in the middle. And her sister Marcel is to the left, and her friend Leonie to the right. And so I grew up in a house where Arabic was spoken, and the different sounds, the music, and the smells that were coming out of the kitchen were like these ghosts of Iraq that had been allowed to live in this house that was very much the house of expatriates / exiles. And so in 1991, my mother saw that my brothers and I at the dinner table were being introduced to the first images we were ever going to see in real time of Iraq, which were these images of the green-tinted CNN footage, night vision of bombs blowing up buildings that I would never get to see in person. And my mother stood in front of the television and she told my brothers and I that there are no Iraqi restaurants in New York. And I didn't quite know what she meant. It was like the Sphinx had spoken. Part of me wondered if she was going to open up an Iraqi restaurant. She's a good enough cook, but it took me years to understand afterwards that she actually was pointing out that there was no visibility of Iraq beyond oil and war, and that was the vulgarity. And so she saw my grandparents' stories about Iraq starting to slip away underneath those images that I was starting to see. The stakes had become higher in the household, and my mother started to transmit the knowledge of everything about Iraq to me and my brothers, and one of those things was cooking. And so this is a typical Sabbath dinner. That's my mother, Ivan. Her last name is David, but it was Daoud before it was anglicized, and that's my dad. He doesn't always look that angry. And we don't have soda at the table anymore. It's illegal. This is imhasha, which is stuffed vegetables. This is kuba kari. And then this is a kind of typical rice. In 2001, September 14th, 2001, I was able to go back into Lower Manhattan. I was living in Queens at the time, and visit friends after the attacks of September 11th. And when I was going to visit my friends in the East Village, I had to walk by St. Mark's Place, and I saw a line going around the block twice. And I didn't quite know what it was, but I thought it was a blood drive or a place where people were going to donate boots to the rescue workers down at Ground Zero. But it ended up that they were waiting to go into a restaurant called Khyber Pass, which is an Afghani restaurant in the city. And this was the only way that people felt like they could, in one way or another, communicate that their grief was not a call for war. And to reassure the Afghani family that in the midst of the war drums that were beating, that they wanted to let them know that they weren't alone and that they weren't going to be abandoned in anger. And so I thought this was a very beautiful artwork that wasn't an artwork. It was a gesture that spoke to me about what one does in a kind of desperate situation, but it was also, it was a beautiful, beautiful action. And so it made me think about the cultural punctures that are created as a result of war, and the way in which in the United States we still don't have many Iraqi restaurants. There are a few in Chicago, which I'll talk about in a second, but there still are no Iraqi restaurants in New York. If you go to Paris, you can't walk too long before finding a North African market or restaurant. And so the kind of warfare that opens up in these places that are more geographically close to one another creates that kind of ghosting, where the smells of the occupied and of the colonized start to kind of invade the oppressor's mainland. And so I thought that was the kind of thing that should be happening in the United States in the midst of a war. And so my mother and I decided, as the drums started to beat towards war in Iraq, that we would start a project together that's an ongoing collaboration we began in 2003 and continues to this day, called Enemy Kitchen. And the project started out as a series of workshops where we were teaching different school groups throughout the United States, and also we made the mistake also of teaching like art institutions, and that was the most boring thing that I could do with this project, because it's like looking across the table and saying, I feel like you. Whereas kids the friction was immediately available because they are fearless speakers. But what was important about these fearless speakers was that in 2003, when a kid's father or brother or mother was going off to fight in the war, they were not allowed to talk about it in school. Principals in New York City, especially in areas around the projects and places like Chelsea and also in the Bronx, were telling teachers not to bring up the war in classrooms because it was too difficult an issue. And I thought this was incredibly wrong and was kind of disastrous. And when we taught this group of students at the Hudson Guild Community Center in 2006, we're teaching 12-year-olds that have spent 5 years of their life growing up in a war culture, and nobody ever asked them how they felt and what their opinions were about it. And so what Enemy Kitchen allowed us to do in this 10-week set of classes at Hudson Guild Community Center was to allow for fearless listening to enable fearless speaking. Iraqi food takes a long time to cook. A lot of these recipes are disappearing because of the kind of speed up of culture. And so as you're making a kubba, it's a very sculptural experience where your hands are shaping this semolina wheat bowl and then filling it with meat, which is a kind of a dumpling. But then, as anybody knows, with busy work, that kind of forms a community around it. You start to speak. And so the kids brought up everything in terms of what the war was communicating to them or telegraphing to them in the classroom at home, and then also their own fears about this culture. And so one day after 3 weeks, there was a student who walked in and said, "Why do we have to make this nasty food? They blow up our soldiers every day, and they knock down the Twin Towers." And what I didn't want to do was proselytize. I just wanted to create a space where this kind of vocalization or utterance could happen. And then another student corrected that student and said it wasn't the Iraqis who knocked down the Twin Towers, it was bin Laden. And then another student from the stove said that it wasn't bin Laden, it was our own government. So in this one moment, you had this kind of panoramic snapshot of everything in terms of like the information streams that were happening at that time and the misinformation that allowed the war to happen in the first place. And so after 10 weeks of learning how to cook this food, the students actually spoke up. They knew I was moving to Chicago, and they said, "You know, we know all about Iraqi cooking. You know nothing about soul food. You know nothing about Latino cooking." And so I said, that's right. And they said, "Well, we want to teach the last class." And as a college professor, my dream is for the students to take over the university. So I thought this inversion of knowledge sharing was perfect. And so they said, "Do Iraqis make Southern fried chicken?" And so I did this spin through the Rolodex of my mother's recipes in my head, and I realized there was nothing like Iraqi fried chicken. And they said, "Well, we're going to invent Iraqi Southern fried chicken." So the next week they had done this, they marinated the chicken in Iraqi bahrat, the spice mix that includes cloves and cinnamon and allspice and ginger and date syrup. And they taught me how to do a shake and bake, which was kind of disgusting. But Iraqi fried chicken was born and was incredibly delicious. So this kind of fusion and this kind of argument and collaboration that happens in the kitchen is something that I really came to cherish. And when the project moved to Chicago, it was important to acknowledge the fact that the city actually has a very vibrant Iraqi community. It's one of the reasons I moved there. And throughout the city, you do find these restaurants that declare themselves as Middle Eastern or Mediterranean. But when you look at the menu, there are certain dishes you can find on the menu that disclose the fact that it's an Iraqi chef or an Iraqi family that owns the restaurant. And I'll talk about that in a second. And so this is a Memorial Day barbecue that I was invited to cater by the Iraq veterans against the war and the Vietnam veterans against the war. So instead of having burgers and hot dogs, they were having kebab and khichdi and all these other Iraqi staples. And it was a very moving experience, but it also inspired the next iteration of Enemy Kitchen. In 2012, I collaborated with these Iraqi refugee chefs at a restaurant called Milo's Pita Place, which was a small restaurant in Chicago's North Side that declared itself as a Mediterranean restaurant. Iraq doesn't have a border on the Mediterranean, but when I looked at the menu, they had the national dish of Iraq listed, mazgouf, which is the carp dish that Rebecca talked about when she introduced me. And so I was very interested in this creative desire to survive in cultural and also biological terms, you know, the way that cooking and recipes are kept alive by these different communities. And again, I was interested in hospitality and hostility being derived from hospice, meaning host or guest or stranger or enemy. And so Enemy Kitchen is run by Iraqi refugee chefs, and the sous chefs and the servers are actually combat veterans, American combat veterans that served in Iraq. And so it inverts that power dynamic that happens in Iraq, where now the Americans are taking orders from the Iraqis. And so you see here, the Iraqi flag that's there is not the generic Iraqi flag. It's actually the Chicago flag rendered in Iraqi colors, which has become a kind of de facto flag of the Iraqi refugee community in Chicago. And then this is an illustration of Milo's Pita Place. I mean, there's the Greek column and everything else that's looking to kind of mask itself. And the reason for this is pretty obvious. They were frightened, as all restaurants in Chicago that are Iraqi are frightened of disclosing themselves in the current sort of climate of xenophobia, which is, of course, incredibly vulgar and violent now. But even during the Obama years and before, this was not something they would dare to do. But then you see on the menu mazgouf and also different dishes like the burak is also a kind of giveaway. And then this is our motley crew in front of the truck. And then the truck itself serves the food itself is served on paper plate replicas of Saddam Hussein's hospitality plates, which is another sub-story that I'll get into here, this little parentheses. In 2011, I was invited by Creative Time to produce what they thought was going to be a small project as a kind of thank you to a restaurant that helped cater all of their events. It's a restaurant called Park Avenue in the Upper East Side, a restaurant that I couldn't afford to eat in if I tried. And they wanted artists to do a kind of culinary intervention on the menu with the chef, something simple. And so they had Marina Abramovich do a baked Alaska. They had Janine Antoni do a piece, Paul Ramirez-Jonas. And when they asked me what I wanted to do in the restaurant, we had a conference call. So on this conference call, I explained to them, like, menus at a place like this are really funny things. You know, they're like museums. Like, they declare provenance, where things are from. They tell you where your arugula comes from. And they also tell you where your meat comes from. It's a way of making the diner feel good. And I wanted to make the diner feel bad. And so instead of having Iraqi date syrup that was veiled by these containers that say things like Basra date syrup. We all know where Basra is, right? The label on the back says product of Netherlands. You can get it here, actually, on St. Catherine. So I've never seen a date palm grow in Holland. And so I wanted to kind of disclose that and to more or less have the date syrup finally say where it was coming from. And so the chef said, that sounds great. What do Iraqis do with date syrup? And I said, well, they make this amazing dessert called dib swarashi, where you mix date syrup with tahini, and it's a little bit like a liquefied halva. And he said, fantastic. I know what I'll do. I'll put date syrup and tahini, and on top of it, I'll put venison. So it's like the American deer hunt meets the Iraqi date harvest. And I said, perfect. And I said, and then it's going to be served on Saddam Hussein's hospitality plates that I bought on eBay. And there was dead silence on the telephone. And then the PR person spoke up and said, I think we're going to get a lot of publicity for this project. And so with that in mind, I forwarded them the plates that I actually was able to find on eBay. One was an American seller located in Iraq who was buying them on flea markets that were vetted by the American armed forces. And another seller was an Iraqi refugee based in Michigan, whose father was a high-ranking officer in the Iraqi Republican Guard. And so the sourcing of these materials was also really important to me. And it turned out that, yes, Saddam Hussein's palaces were looted by everyday Iraqis who took these symbols of power, things like the chandeliers and the plates, and started to use them as their everyday flatware, and then would sit in the couches that they were able to take out of his palaces. And so the idea was that the plates themselves appear on this table and are part of this dish that we've decided to call spoils, and that it creates this kind of troubled triangle where the bitterness of the surface of the plate, the sweetness of the date syrup, and the diner's tongue kind of create an extreme tension. Now, the date syrup itself was one of these things that brought me to dates. And dates, it turns out, are plentiful in Iraq. Like I said, there were over 30 million palms in the 70s when dates accounted for its second largest export next to oil. And it was, there's over 600 different varieties within Iraq itself. And so the date is to Iraq what the cigar is to Cuba and what the wine is to France. So as part of a project called Return, I reopened my grandfather's import-export company that he ran in Baghdad, and then he reopened in the United States when they fled in 1946, with the sole purpose of importing 1 ton of Khastawi dates to the United States. So I was the first company in over 40 years to sign a contract to import 1 ton of dates, and it was for an insane amount of money. $7,000, and the import people that I was working with were telling me this is really bad business. And I said, yes, but it could be really good art. And so I had done it with a grant from the New York Foundation for the Arts for a $7,000 grant I received in architecture and environmental structures. And they kept asking, how is this architecture and environmental structures? And I kept showing them these pictures of the boxes of dates, and that, you know, it's the perfect environmental structure. And so these are the designs of the boxes. When the Iraqis found out that they could say whatever they wanted to say to the American public with the design of the boxes, they gave us an art history lesson. On the lower right-hand side, Babylon, Iraq, Ishtar Gate reconstructed. On the top left, Babylon, Iraq, genuine lion. You know, that lion's still there, and this is the reconstruction out of pathetic materials of something that was taken by the Germans. And then they even go so far as to list product of Iraq and print the flag. And they started to give me a tour of their office, you know, when the date boxes came back from the printer. And then after 3 weeks of being brought back and forth in a hot truck in September and October of 2006, the dates ended up cooking in that truck as they waited in lines of cars of refugees that were days long at the border with Jordan. So the dates ended up cooking and had to be scuttled in Syria. So the dates ended up dying, but also sharing the same kind of path and illustrating the path of Iraqi refugees that were desperately trying to flee the sectarian violence that had emerged in the aftermath of the American occupation. But after this had happened, the Iraqi company was enraged, and they said, there's absolutely no way that we're going to leave your store unstocked. We're not going to let it be empty. If we have to haunt that space, we will. And they ended up airlifting out 10 boxes of dates, a kind of token, for an extremely expensive price via DHL. And that's when the shit hit the fan. And the dates ended up, after 2 days, coming from Baghdad to New York but it ended up being delayed and only released after 3 weeks, during which time the small parcel underwent inspections from Homeland Security, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, the U.S. FDA, and the USDA. So much to the horror of the customs broker I was working with, the customs agents determined that the ship needed to be sent back to Iraq because we were quote unquote at war with Iraq, and the customs broker himself even became radicalized in this and said, "You idiot, the war is technically over, we're supposed to be rebuilding the country." And so this is the big scandal, the dates, the fruit that asked questions and scandalized every government agency from Baghdad to Damascus to Brooklyn. And so with the dates in the store, I changed the sign on the facade to read "Iraqi dates have arrived." And so people flocked in to try these dates. And the dates themselves, it's important to note that it's a harbinger of good things to come. And the first moment of a baby's life, a newborn baby's life, you're supposed to put a date in its mouth in Iraq so that its first taste of life is sweet. And this is how my projects get reviewed. This is the New York Post running an article, "Saddam does the dishes." And 2 days before the project was supposed to end, I ended up getting this, a cease and desist letter from the US State Department. The subject line of the email was "Surrender the plates, the Iraqi plates belonging to Saddam Hussein." It was kind of surreal that even the inanimate objects had to surrender. And so I was wondering who it was that made the request that these plates be returned. And so I said, well, whatever it is, it's the perfect way for the project to end. When those artifacts that were looted from the museum end up in other countries, they end up having these repatriation ceremonies. And I said, all I want to do then is to be able to photograph or to film the repatriation ceremony. I wanted to know who wanted Saddam Hussein's plates back. And so they said it shouldn't be a problem. I happened to be in New York visiting family when I got a very kind of worried phone call from Ann Pasternak at Creative Times saying, can you get here quickly? The State Department is sending their people tomorrow to retrieve the plates. And so I went to Creative Times offices where these two officers from the Forfeiture and Assets Division of the State Department were there not only to collect the plates, but to authenticate them, to make sure that they were in fact Wedgwood china, to make sure that they were Limoges, because the last thing they wanted to do was to spend time getting these plates and to have them be fake. And I was kind of confused as to why this was so important to make sure that they were authentic, and they were authentic in the end. But it turned out that the call had been made directly from DC to collect these plates, and I'm going to let the video do the rest of the speaking about this project.
In this way, I think the project follows through with a lot of the traces that I was interested in terms of where the object went, where it belongs, the history that's loaded inside of it. I'm somebody who doesn't believe in the destruction of monuments and in the tearing down of symbols of power that people may have resisted or may have resented. I think that's part of a place's history. And I think that when those symbols are erased, you're dealing with an unhealthy amnesia that countries and people tend to fall into.
We're dropping them off right now to the Iraqi
Embassy.
The Iraqi mission on 79th Street.
Of the
With that,
The Iraqi PM was in town, Bush, yesterday.
With Obama.
Wow. You got me on Bush before. So I know he was hoping to bring them back on his trip back.
Wow.
So I don't know if it's going to happen that quick or not, but that's why they wanted to
That's
do it
why
today.
they wanted it so quickly.
Wow.
Yeah, it came all the way from DC to request to get this done today.
I was a little bit surprised that the Iraq mission to the UN would want back the symbols that the US and many of the people in Iraq had seemed so eager to dispel and to destroy. The address of the Iraq mission to the UN is 14 East 79th Street. We're standing in front of the Iraq mission to the UN, and we're here because the US Marshals are turning the plates over to the Iraqi government. What they told us in Creative Times offices was that they wanted this to coincide with Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's visit to Washington. He was in DC yesterday meeting with President Obama. And they're looking to bring the plates back home to Iraq on the same flight as the current Iraqi Prime Minister. I think the way that embassies and missions work is that you're technically on Iraqi soil, or you're on the soil of the country of the embassy, and so we're on Iraqi soil. This is the first time my family has been back. So they'll be returned to Iraq?
Yes.
Tomorrow?
I'm not sure, but very soon.
Okay.
Very soon.
Will it go in a museum or?
Should be.
Should be, yeah. What I heard was that the plates were a gift from the Queen of England.
That's right.
Wedgwood china. So, and then the more recent china, all different places, Limoges, Italy. Thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you.
And inshallah, good times ahead.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I had no idea. I honestly thought that we would be in some kind of office where people were getting passport visas or something else, and I'd never expected this level of state presence. I mean, these people walking in and out of the room, opening the door, shutting the door. It was like a striptease.
Best new thing in the world today is obviously the end of the Iraq War. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta saying today in Baghdad that Iraq is now fully responsible for directing its own path. The war ending as it should. Iraq now becoming its own sovereign country without our flag flying over it anywhere, without our troops anywhere in it. That's easily the best new thing in the world, maybe this decade. But there's another Iraq story that is ending as it should. It doesn't beat the end of the war, but it's pretty good. This fall, a Chicago-based artist got together with a New York City arts group and a restaurant. They put together an ambitious, big-thinking art project. They found on eBay dinner plates believed to have been looted from Saddam Hussein's palaces after the US invasion. They bought the plates, and as an interactive art installation, they served on Saddam's flatware and plates venison with tahini and date syrup and pomegranates. The project was called Spoils. The artist said he wanted diners to think about how the plates got to their table. Quote, "This is about the symbols of power in that regime that have now come into the ownership of the populace that were living under Hussein," he told the New York Times last month. But you can't just buy Saddam's dinner plates on eBay. Not legally, anyway. When the art group was formally notified that the plates really belonged to the Iraqi people and needed to be returned, they agreed to give them up. So earlier this week, in what the New York Times described as a strange but cordial visit, the artist helped the US Marshals pack up the plates so they could be delivered to the Iraqi mission at the UN. By Tuesday afternoon, the plates had made their way to DC, where Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was in town to meet with President Obama. The plates were then scheduled to fly back to Iraq with Maliki on his private plane on Wednesday, which is to say this ambitious, big-thinking art project ended as it should have. The Iraq War is over. Iraq is a sovereign nation. And one of the very small things that means is that they get their stuff back, too. Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Have a great night.
If only it were that simple, right? You know? And here you have the New York Times declaring that the Iraq War is over, and this time it's not a yes men project. And then at the very end of the newspaper, that minor object ends up becoming part of that story. So it's a continuing interest that I have in the way that objects themselves can be ghosts at tables. And it was really interesting to me that in the aftermath of the United States' desire to nation build in Iraq, It was the Iraqi flag that tells you the whole story. They got rid of the 3 green stars which had preceded Saddam's regime, but they kept the takbir, the Allahu Akbar, that had been handwritten between those 3 green stars. And that in celebrating the end of the Iraq War, Nouri al-Maliki wanted those plates belonging to Saddam to come back and to be seen by the Iraqi people. So it was a really interesting critique through art history in a lot of ways of the way that the war had unfolded. And so the truck continues to be a sort of project. It pops up whenever it needs to, like herpes or something, and it ends up kind of irritating Chicago's public. This is another iteration of the carp. I can't talk too much about that, but that's a grill that's made out of a Humvee that was destroyed in Iraq. And then the knives that I use for Enemy Kitchen now have been made for me custom by Haidar Syed Muhsin, who was Saddam Hussein's personal sword maker. And so it's about mobilizing these materials and also ingesting them as a kind of as a communion. And so when you come to the truck and you see people cooking on the truck, you have these veterans and the refugees working together, and when you make a kebab, a fist is what forms the meat around the skewer, and so it's a refugee fist, a veteran fist, a refugee fist, a veteran's fist. So it becomes this kind of sculptural void that you're taking into your body. And so we actually got this spread in Time Out section of the Time Out food section in Chicago, which pissed off a lot of chefs because we had not earned it yet. But what that did is it directed a lot of traffic to Milo's Pita Place. And so they've existed now for the past 5 years without the time to take the truck out because Milo's Pita Place became so popular that they decided to pursue their dreams. So Milo's Pita Place became Milo's Palace. And they opened up an Iraqi nightclub at 2639 Peterson Avenue in Chicago, if you ever want to go out for great Iraqi food and amazing Iraqi music. This is the place to go. And they've even come out of the closet even more now. They've rebranded themselves as Babylon Bistro. And so there are all these microeconomies that emerge from a project like this where they're hiring these musicians that are very famous in Iraq, in northern Iraq, but can't sustain their practice as musicians in the United States. But every Friday and Saturday night, the place is lit with Ali Rashid, who won Iraqi Idol in 2005, and Wali Lasmar, Milad Yunus. And I love these posters. And so, everyone, with these socially engaged projects, it seems as though the art world has kind of taken this turn towards the entrepreneurial, where it's almost like you sort of are cornered into running a business or having something that's sustainable. And one of the things that I love about these projects is that after they leave my hands, they can become something different, like a compost in the world for something else to build on. So the truck itself becomes a kind of transitional object and ends up in the corner afterwards, where all these things that grow on it, it's a little less about sustainability and more about evolution, how these projects can continue in the world without being art in and of itself. And that's a typical night at Milo's Palace. Do I have time for one more project, or yeah? All right, well, I'm going to skip this last food one. This was great. This was Enemy Kitchen. They invited me to do Enemy Kitchen in Dubai, and it didn't make any sense. And I said, if you want me to do something with food and friction, I'll open up the first Jewish restaurant, Iraqi Jewish restaurant in the Arab world in over 80 years. And luckily, the curators were just as suicidal as I was. And so they said, let's do that. So we opened up Dar al-Sul, which was an iteration of Enemy Kitchen in Dubai, which was very beautiful, where the Iraqi and Palestinian diaspora came together and realized that these fates were intertwined because it was the emergence of Zionism as a kind of nationalist ideology and the emergence of Arab nationalism on the other side that had put minorities like the Jews in Iraq and then Palestinians themselves into a position where their lives were ghosted. And so this kind of like food of the ghost, the subtitle of the project was "You're eating a dying language from the plate of a ghost." And instead of Saddam's plates being used, I was thinking again about breaking the vitrine, but then instead of it being about looting, allowing for the flatware that was brought over by the Iraqi Jews when they left Iraq to be used again at a table in the Arab world, and allowing Arab Jews to be reactivated and reanimated in a space where they had long since disappeared. And this is the serving tray from the Great Synagogue of Baghdad on which dates from Iraq were served to everybody at the beginning of the meal, so the whole experience was guaranteed to be sweet. I worked with Regine Basha on this project as well. She's my collaborator on this, along with Ella Shohat. Regine, her family is from Iraq as well. She actually is from Montreal as well, and she was the director of the Sadie Bronfman Center years ago. She's collated all of the Iraqi Jewish music. The musicians in Iraq in the 30s and the 40s that were most popular at the time were, in fact, Jews, and this was a byproduct of a Jewish school for the blind. So your amazing oud players and kanun players were, in a lot of cases, blind people like Abraham Salman, and it was the Iraqi musical history, the sort of modern Iraqi musical history blends the musicianship of the Iraqi Jewish community with the Quranic singing methods that were, so central to singers like Nazim Ghazali and also the Kuwaiti brothers. And so there was a real kind of evidence of the music being a place where you had this melange of different cultures and this kind of plurality. And then this is Ella Shohat doing a kind of typical Iraqi Jewish greeting to begin the meal. And this is Ella correcting me in the kitchen. This is the most beautiful thing that can happen in a kitchen. An argument in a kitchen, a war in the kitchen is the best kind of war, because you learn from it. And the stakes are lower. But this is her telling me that I was making the eggs wrong. And so she took over. And we created a family. And so this kind of family-style eating is not something that happens very often. Turns out that for 6 months in 1958, the flag of Iraq was actually the same as the Palestinian flag. So this was one of the only things that hung in the restaurant space. So it was a way of making Palestine a kind of part of the narrative of this disappearance. And then one of the things that we were always having to kind of sort of wrestle with was the way in which we were being seen from the Jewish diaspora, and most specifically the Zionist Jewish diaspora, that were so eager to point out that the reason that the Jews left Iraq were because of things like the Farhud, or the violent dispossession, which was a kind of pogrom that happened in Baghdad in June of 1941. And the truth is, yes, it did happen. But what people never bring to the surface are the narratives of those Muslim and Christian neighbors that hid their Jewish neighbors or guarded their houses against these throngs of angry mobs, that they were like these sort of like these nationalists that had taken to the streets. And so those narratives end up getting lost when you flatten history. And so the only photograph that hung in Dar al-Sulh was this photograph that was given to me by my friend Emily Jasser, a Palestinian artist with whom I share a friendship and also a kind of sort of brotherhood and sisterhood in thought. And she gave me this photo, and it's of Palestinians protecting the Magen Abraham synagogue in Beirut from attacks during the Lebanese Civil War in December of 1975. And every time I try to tell those stories about the people who had saved their Jewish neighbors in the Farhud, it's always the next question is always about the lack of evidence. But for me, this photo is that photo of what happened in Iraq in the 40s. And so this is our family that we created in Dubai. This is the Dar al-Sulh team. And it makes me think of this photo. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm happy to take questions.
Curious to know what you think or hear your thoughts about America's current interest in, certain Americans' interest in getting rid of Civil War statues in the South.
Yeah, it's a great question. Whenever I see myself in that video, there's two things I think is that, one is that I wish I could shave this mustache, which my wife and my kids won't let me shave. And the other thing is, I'm always asking how my thinking on that has evolved. And when I think about the destruction of those monuments in Iraq, I can't help but think about the way this was a very carefully choreographed program that was spearheaded by the Americans, not the Iraqis. That the Saddam Hussein sculpture coming down in Trafalgar Square was something that was a plan, to more or less throw an image up on the television that brought back memories of the Lenin statues coming down in Eastern Europe. And it wasn't the everyday Iraqis that looked to pull it down. And in fact, we all know how the Americans fucked that up when they went and they put an American flag over Saddam's face, and the entire crowd that was cheering for them completely turned on them until they put an Iraqi flag over Saddam's face. When I think about what's happening in the South, I think this question of decolonizing spaces is something for the people who live there and who have actually dealt with that traumatic history as people who were oppressed. It's for them to decide. As an American, I don't feel like I can make a decision about those monuments, not from the position in which I sit. I can understand the catharsis that arrives from ridding oneself of those memories of that history. But what I worry about in the disappearance of something that exposes the traces of our problems and our failures is that it erases the fact that they happened. And I think that it's important for there to be spaces in public. I believe in a public space that is troubling. I believe in a public space that isn't always about comfort. I think that comfort and happiness are incredibly overrated to begin with. But I think that it's important to have spaces that can contest and speak back to the way things have been forgotten and are often laying silent. So for instance, one of the things that a friend of mine from South Africa told me, and Victor, you can tell me if this is not true, was that as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after Mandela came to power, there was a discussion of what to do with the apartheid-era monuments. And instead of tearing them down, the idea was that the ANC-era monuments would be put up next to them. Is that accurate? It's kind of accurate. It has been pulled down. So, but that program conceptually interests me about setting up a moment of tension between a monument and a counter-monument. Something very similar has happened in Philadelphia with the Frank Rizzo statue and Hank Willis Thomas and a kind of enlarged version of a hair pick. And everybody knows about Frank Rizzo being a racist and being this horrible commander of the police in Philadelphia. But it seemed to me that there might be other ways to be thinking about this, but it's not as though I hold, Stonewall Jackson or any of these other people from the South to be people that are to be valorized. I think that something very interesting is happening. I think that we're starting to maybe live in the era of Parisia, of truth-telling. So much of everything that's happening now with the exposure of misogyny and the sex scandals and everything else that we're hearing about is actually a very refreshing voice speaking out against a kind of ingrained and programmed volatility and violence. And I wouldn't, as somebody who deals with these suppressed memories, I think that this is a very valuable time. You know, it's quite a time to see emerging in front of me. As somebody who's also interested in public art, but I also think that the most important thing now that's happening is just the sort of like collective truth-telling that's happening. And so, you know, I think it is a case-by-case basis, but I think also it's for those communities to determine what they want to do. Tearing down a statue of Stonewall Jackson is not, for me, the sort of iconoclasm that I would want to stand up against. You know, it's not the Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed. But even the rationale for that destruction is an interesting one to get into because it's nuanced. You know, I'm not in favor of the Bamiyan Buddhas being destroyed. It was a tragedy for me because I was trained as a stone carver, and it was the first example of stone carving that I'd been introduced to. But when you read Mullah Omar talking about it, it's a really interesting critique. He talks about how the Swedes had approached the Afghanis with $20 million to repair one of the Bamiyan Buddhas. And they were in the middle of a famine. And they asked that they could use it to feed the Afghani people. And the Swedes said, no, this has to be put towards rebuilding the Bamiyan Buddhas, or to maintain the Bamiyan Buddhas, which had been sort of damaged by the rains. And so he had actually stood up for the Buddhas to be spared the wrecking ball because the Taliban was going and destroying any kinds of idols of other gods and anything that had the human kind of figuration. And he stood up against it 3 times to say that this is important, this is part of Afghanistan's history, this is also going to be what people want to visit when they come here. And then after these Westerners from Sweden had made the Buddhas more precious than the people, he thought it was despicable and decided to destroy them the same way that somebody might destroy a hostage or kill a hostage. And it's not as easy as that, you know, because they also used it as an opportunity to murder tens of thousands of the Hazara minority in Bamiyan. But it actually is an interesting way of thinking about the way that material culture seems to be the thing that causes the biggest outrage, and that human life can be so expendable.
Michael, I have a question.
Yeah.
How do your Jewish roots play into your work? It seems that there's a connection that's very strong in the story of heritage. Can you share that with us, how your Jewish heritage is working forward?
For me, it has, you know, something to do with a certain, you know, just like comfort of, you know, it's just the space I was brought up in. But the more and more I realize that there's the more and more I delve into it, the more and more I realize that it is very specifically the Arab Jewish culture. And it may as well just be Arab culture. It may as well just be Iraqi. Because one of the things that we go deeper into this with Dar al-Salh, with Ella Shohat, is that she, as a cultural theorist and as a critic, you know, has been, you know, she was the one who really started to use this term, Arab Jew, in the 1990s, the early 1990s, as somebody who had been raised in Israel after her family left Iraq, and to kind of point to the kind of Zionist ideology of being exclusive not only of Palestinians but of their Arab brethren that were coming from the Jewish communities in Iraq. And so one of the things she points to is the way that you know, Jewish cookbooks, for instance, are kind of a marketing of so much of this mythology of nationalist ideology. And very one of the things that she points out very astutely is that Iraqi Jewish cooking is just Iraqi cooking. You know, of course, there are some dishes that you leave on the stove for a 24-hour period on the Sabbath, which is like cholent. In Europe, we have it in Iraq, it's called tabit. And but beyond that, it's more or less the same way that, European Jewish cooking or Ashkenazi Jewish cooking bears the very strong traces of Polish cooking or Hungarian cooking, or, lox, is pervasive all over Germany and into Scandinavia and Northern Europe. So those kinds of things are a kind of linguistic and also cultural block that I'd like to deconstruct, because it gets rid of this the kind of differences that people are so quick to kind of label and brand, and it reinforces a lot of what nationalist ideologies try to uphold, to kind of not only create difference but create these kinds of concepts of superiority. So this idea of Arab Jew being a kind of hyphenated term, Ella has pointed out very beautifully about the way that the hyphen as a kind of physical typographical instance is a bridge between the Arab and the Jew, and it becomes this kind of way to bring those two things closer together. Because when I think about my Jewishness, it has very little to do with matzo balls. I thought matzo balls were from Sinai. I grew up without them, and I didn't taste it until I was in college. So that kind of cultural experience of Judaism had very little to do with me. Even some of the prayers, like the Unatana Tokef, which you sing during Yom Kippur, which is what Leonard Cohen used to write Who by Fire, right? That's actually a liturgical piece that comes out of the Middle Ages in Europe. And I couldn't find it in any of the Iraqi prayer books that my grandfather had left behind for us from Baghdad. And the reason was because they had completely different traditions. They also had prayers that were sung in Arabic. So for me, my Jewish kind of cultural identity is something that maybe emerges, through this exploration of ritual. I'm very interested in the Passover Seder, as an artwork, for instance. I love the symbolism of the hard-boiled egg and what that's supposed to represent, the salt water, and I love the fact that it can be updated, where in my family we put the olive on the Seder plate as a kind of remembrance of the fact that people are being persecuted still, and the olive on the Seder plate is supposed to be this remembrance of Palestine. And it becomes a way of actually recognizing Jewishness, if that is going to be my ideological subscription and my cultural subscription, then what you take out of it that's good is that you point it back at what's happening. And if you say that Zionism was about this kind of idealistic ingathering of exiles, there's no program that I know of in the world where an ingathering of exiles should create another exile. That to me is a program that I can never get behind. So I think the Jewishness that I'm trying to deal with is one where it is something that I think a lot of people who are brought up, in any religion are holding on to the things that they think are humanistic and are ethically, a set of ethical imperatives that they think go well with the world. And so if something is being done in the name of Judaism, when in fact it's not, it's a nationalist program, I look to kind of recoup that in a way. And that's some of what is in the piece at the MAC, which is to kind of say, okay, if we want to talk about being Jewish, then this is where it's completely betraying itself. But I get uncomfortable talking about religion because then there are people who just take it very literally. And there's so many ridiculous, passages within religious scripture that tell you to kill people who grow different kinds of crops next to each other. And, that kind of thing is just bad writing, Now, that's a great question. In case you didn't hear, she just asked about my process and how I start and if I want to go back to things. And I think that, I first get interested in an idea, that it can be anything like, with the Iraq Museum, it was actually an article in the New York Times that came out in 2005 that was actually called "The Ghost of the Iraq Museum," and it was about Donny George. And in that one article was everything, that I put in those drawings, including the fact that he was a drummer. And so for me, I had wanted to do something about the looting of the Iraq Museum ever since it had happened, because it seemed to me the only moment of pathos that had opened up in the war. That no matter if you were for or against the war, we could agree that this was a catastrophe. And it was an outrage. But what I found to be so saddening and angering was that the outrage around objects that went missing did not translate into outrage around lives that had gone missing, around looted lives, And so it was really important to me that in this program of reconstructing these artifacts that, someone like Donny George's story was made present, where he tells the story of every Iraqi that can't go back, like those artifacts. That the artifacts themselves actually start out as votive sculptures, those statues of the figures in prayer. Those were actually brought to the temple, the temples that people would go to, the shrines, and you would go and you would pray and you would leave that little sculpture as a kind of surrogate for yourself, so that guy was always praying for you. And I wondered, how could we turn those votive statues into votive statues of the missing Iraqis, And in a way, it's an impossible project, but in committing to it as an artwork that is going to outlive me and the studio, because as you know, there's like over 8,000 that are still missing from the museum. It's between 7,000 and 8,000. And there's more and more every day that's being destroyed in the aftermath of the, the Iraq War, or I should say in the continuation of it. And the commitment to actually rebuild those things and to know that we're never going to finish is a way of speaking to the volume of that kind of loss. And it more or less points to a process that has no end. But in terms of where they begin in these moments when, I'm being intrigued by something. And to be honest with you, if I hadn't read that Donny George was a drummer in a band, I don't know how the project would have evolved. There was something that writer did that was so important and so responsible, where he humanized this person in this article, and so much dehumanization of the Iraqi people was happening simultaneously. So I wanted to know about an Iraqi's hobby, or side gig, And in terms of getting a second chance and things like that, I feel like a lot of these projects have had a sort of first iteration that didn't quite work, or I wanted to do something else with it, So like, for instance, Return, which was the project where I was importing Iraqi dates, began as a project in 2004, where I had done it as a very humble piece, where I reopened my grandfather's company, but as a Dropbox. And I used the budget for the exhibition that invited me to be in it to send objects free of charge for Iraqis that were living in the United States back to Iraq, because it was a way of illustrating the way that shipping had also collapsed. And when shipping collapses, communication and connection collapses, and people don't belong anymore to their place or to each other. And it became so much more powerful when I was importing the dates as well. It became a much more robust project, because not only was I still shipping things for Iraqis, but I was also pointing out that there was a story that was happening where these dates were actually the surrogates for the Iraqi people. And they were traveling that same precarious path and not getting to their destinations and not going home. So that was a really important, thing that I learned about my own practice, and it happened in Parasite too. Just don't stop doing it. That these projects are a little bit like protein. The yogurt gets better the more and more you let it sit. Everything changes. And I like to have those live cultures survive in the work, and to allow it to keep changing, and not just say that everything is tidily wrapped up and it's over. Does that answer? Well, the interest in doing something about it, about Leonard, was one that I didn't think I was ever going to come to naturally. I mean, it's a project that like is born out of a relationship. It's born out of falling in love with my wife and being influenced by her and her family, and spending endless vacations, not endless vacations, but endlessly spending vacations in the winter up here, or at their house that they have in Vermont. And, there's a CD that's always on rotation in there, which is the best of Leonard Cohen. And I had no relationship with Leonard Cohen really until 2009. I mean, I heard him for the first time when I was restoring Torahs as an internship during art school, to keep learning over a summer, and also to make some money. And, as I'm restoring Torahs, we're listening to Arabic music because the guy who was working with me was a Yemeni Jew. And the guy who was running the Jewish art studio, that was what it was called, but the guy who was the scribe, who was licensed to repair the Torahs, was Ashkenazi from Europe. And so he would get tired of constantly hearing this Arabic music, and as a chaser, he'd put on a Leonard Cohen cassette. And I didn't know what to make of Leonard Cohen. It wasn't music that I disliked, but it sounded a lot like Neil Diamond, like early good Neil Diamond, right? And I didn't quite know what to make of it. And then when I found out that everybody in art school liked it, I hated it because I didn't want to like what everybody liked, And then, knowing that he was from Montreal and spending time up here in Montreal, the songs became familiar. And then when my wife was pregnant with our first child, we ended up, for her birthday, for my wife's birthday, we ended up getting tickets from her parents to see Leonard Cohen at the Chicago Theater. And it blew me away because I didn't expect to be blown away. I said this on the panel with at the opening at the MAC, but I've seen Paul McCartney in rehearsal, and I've seen Springsteen countless times, and those to me were like as close as I was ever going to get to religious experiences. But Leonard Cohen made Rosh Hashanah interesting for me. Like he held a room in a way where he was simultaneously like a messianic figure, but also Elvis. At 75 years old, he wasn't dyeing his hair, like everybody in the Stones. He was old and he was worn, and he realized its beauty, and I fell in love with the words, and that was it. It was, there's two things that happened to me in my life. John Lennon was killed, and that opened up my obsession about the Beatles, and then I saw a Leonard Cohen concert. And I realized that, maybe I'll peak when I'm 80 as well, And so that was a really inspiring moment for me. And what he said in his words were the things that I held on to. The Iraq War was still happening, and he sang Anthem, which has the words that everybody's printing on T-shirts now, and it's the title of the exhibition because it's the most beautiful thing, Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I'm working with veterans, and their lives are broken. And I'm working with these refugees, and every single project that I'm doing feels like just this little wedge that I'm putting underneath the door to let that light in, because it is a horrible experience. And we're all suffering from depression, and we're all surrounded by this rotten cultural moment, this human moment that we're in, but the resistance is to still let each other know that we love one another, and that we are working towards radical love, that there is this thing that we're not going to let go of, and that to me was a very simple way of saying you light a candle in the darkness. And then he said during his recitation of 1,000 Kisses Deep, I'm good at love, I'm good at hate, it's in between I freeze. And I started to cry, because that's me, right? That's everybody. Like, we're so great at the extremes, and it's in between, nuance gets lost. And I have this long-standing relationship with Palestine. And I'm a signatory of the cultural boycott. And I realized that a boycott annihilates a certain kind of audience, but so does love. When you love somebody, you annihilate the people you don't love, right? So that's okay, you know? And in this moment, I want to be able to kind of mobilize, you know, that love at being able to point out that there's an injustice that's happening. And that if Leonard's music can't be heard in Palestine because he decides that, you know, with his manager, that they're not going to drop the Tel Aviv gig to play in Ramallah, and this is something that happened in 2009, and I'm speaking to all of you like you know about it, but go see the show and you'll learn about it. But the thing that I felt was that he was almost describing the human question and the nuance that gets lost in the space of conflict. And I decided to title my project that was about questioning whether or not Leonard's music could be recuperated in Palestine after he made that decision. And the reason is because people love his music. But what does it mean when the person whose words you love start to become part of the war and they're being played on the other side? How do you listen to them? You know, and so it became this question for me of like whether listening to Leonard Cohen in Ramallah was like hearing Wagner in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's a question that's still out there. I feel like this project is one of those unfinished ongoing projects as well, you know. So in a way, you asked me about Jewishness, Victor, and I think one of the things that connected me to Leonard was that there was something that was so poetic about his Judaism and the way that he was able to recognize Judaism as being just a collection of awesome poems that made me realize, amidst a popularity that I knew he had in the Arab world, that there was something to working with his oeuvre, you know, working with his body of work and actually thinking of it as like, well, is the body dead or is the body alive? And we're still trying to figure that out. You know, I'm constantly having conversations with musicians in Palestine who want to do the concert with me, you know, and to, you know, reincarnate the meaning in Leonard's lyrics. But they have a question about what it means for them afterwards. Because when they're seen playing this man's music, it doesn't come without consequences, you know? And I think it's a really interesting place to be, in that space of paralysis, and to understand it as something that's very real.
Hello everyone, my name is François Letourneau, I'm from the Contemporary Art Museum. So I simply want to stand to thank Michael for his wonderful generosity. Thank you all for your presence. I also want to point out that Michael will be speaking about his work at the Musée tomorrow at 5. So if you want to join us there, it would also be a great occasion to see you. So thanks again for your presence. Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks for being here.